order. Welcome to meeting number 84 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. Feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to a microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Witnesses, pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, October 23, 2023, the committee commenced its study of rights of victims, reclassification, and transfer of federal offenders. I would now like to welcome our witnesses today. Union of Canadian Correctional Officers, Jeff Wilkins, National President by video conference. Union of Safety and Justice Employees, Patrick Menard, Regional Vice President, Quebec, by video conference. Jeff Sandelli, Regional Vice President, CSC Community, PBC West, by video conference. Welcome to you all. Up to 5 minutes will be given for the opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. I now invite Mr. Wilkins to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And good afternoon, members of the committee and colleagues and witnesses here today. My name is Jeff Wilkins. I'm the National President of the Union of Canadian Correctional Officers, and I appreciate the invitation to speak with you today and hopefully help answer some very important questions that you may have regarding the rights of victims of crime, security reclassification, and the transfer of offenders under the mandate of the Correctional Service of Canada. I'm going to keep my introductory statements as brief as I can because I think time is probably better served for questions. That being said, there are a few things that I'd like to say which may perhaps frame any questions that you have. When reviewing the motion that was made to task this committee to investigate the rights of victims, security reclassifications, and the transfer of inmates, it's very clear that this committee has been struck in relation to the highly publicized transfer of Paul Bernardo. I should therefore advise you in this introductory statement that I may not be able to answer all of your particular questions surrounding this particular transfer. Though correctional officers perform a very important role in documenting daily routines and behaviors of inmates, we are unfortunately a very small part of an inmate's case management team. Quite often, decisions made by the CSC are made without any knowledge from our members, which was most certainly the case for this particular transfer. A role of a correctional officer as part of the case management team would be to report on things like institutional behavior, attendance in their programming or school, participation in institutional visits, or handling general requests for private family visits. These reports, which are often compiled into casework records by CX2, are then used by parole officers and other members of the inmate's case management team to have a more direct understanding of the inmate's behavior against their correctional plan. It's certainly our hope that these reports also make it to the parole officer when analyzing things like security classification reviews or other assessments for decision. However, we sometimes question why we're not more involved in the assessments for decision, as it's our members who are with the inmates 24/7 and have a better understanding of their particular caseload of inmates than most members of the CMT or case management team. As I'm sure all here understand, the Correctional Service uses what's called a custody rating scale to determine penitentiary placements as well as transfers to lower levels of security. The scale looks at three main elements: the level of institutional adjustment, the inmate's risk to the public, as well as the risk of escape. Ultimately, the scale is used to determine the inmate's security classification as either a maximum, medium, or a minimum. And whether this scale needs to be amended is certainly up for debate, and I'm not the statistical professional that's going to weigh in on the validity of the scale. However, as it stands now, the union certainly has issues when the scale is overridden, as was the case with this particular inmate. According to the report released by the Correctional Service of Canada, his custody rating scale was overridden to maintain a maximum security status since 1999. The issue that we have, that I believe is more detrimental to the safety of our communities, is when a custody rating scale is overridden to place an inmate in a lower level of security than the scale determines. This is where our members, correctional officers, lose faith in the scale itself. There have been situations where inmates have been overridden to minimum security, in which the custody rating scale determined that they were medium, which ultimately, in one particular instance, led to an escape and the murder of a member of the public. This is a dangerous practice. And though I don't have the latest statistic for all inmates in minimum security currently, there are many inmates that are incarcerated in a minimum facility who do not meet the criteria for minimum under the custody rating scale. As for any discussion around the rights of victims, you're only going to hear from the Union of Canadian Correctional Officers that more should be done to promote victims' rights. We have the duty in our service to mandate to protect the public, and as victims, who are members of the public, they should be of paramount consideration. It is encouraging that the CSC has accepted the recommendation which originated from the latest review conducted that they will form a multidisciplinary working group to look at enhancing the policies and practice around victim notification and engagement. And we welcome the opportunity to put forward some ideas in that working group. However, to date, we have not yet received an invitation as a union. With that, I'm going to end my introductory comments and welcome any questions that you have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkins. You had about 10 seconds left, so you're on key. Now I invite Mr. Menard and Mr. Sandelli to make an opening statement, and I understand you will share your time. So whichever one goes first.
Je vais débuter.
I can start. So, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the members of the committee for this invitation to speak on behalf of the Union of Safety and Justice Employees. USJE has some 18,000 members, a large proportion of whom work for Correctional Service Canada. I hold the position of Regional Vice President for Quebec, and I represent members working in federal penitentiaries. Before being elected to USJE, I worked as a penitentiary parole officer for 22 years. I worked in a multi-security level psychiatric facility, but also in medium security institutions and in an initial assessment unit. I've also had the opportunity to be a local trainer for new employees and an internship supervisor for future parole officers. I've represented CSC at training sessions for other organizations such as the Canada Border Services Agency and the Quebec Mental Health Review Board. Our members include a large number of employees in first responder roles. Our members work in prisons as peace officers as well. They work with offenders on a daily basis or provide services to victims and to the public. Our members are professionals who provide skills and employability training to our inmates, who reduce risk through programs and interventions, who identify the causes of crime, intervene, follow up, and assess offenders, who make recommendations to decision makers, especially concerning transfers, temporary absences, and discharge. Our members provide services to victims and ensure that wrongs made to them are taken into account when decisions are made. Our members carry out their work while taking into account police reports, court decisions, victims' concerns, medical reports, and other professionals' reports, as well as the offender's progresses. USJE members thus contribute to respecting victims' rights and reducing the risk of recidivism in the community. Thank you for your attention. I now give the floor to Mr. Jeff Sandelli.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Sandelli, and I began my career with the Correctional Service of Canada in 2008 as an institutional parole officer at Stony Mountain Medium Security Institution, which is located north of Winnipeg. I spent 2 years gathering critical experience to garner an understanding of the mechanisms related to an offender's entry into and journey through the federal sentence. In a nutshell, this entry commences with intake assessments of offenders who have been federally sentenced, continues with opportunities for federal offenders to engage in various interventions to address their needs, and capacity for rehabilitation, and then is followed by an assessment of the offender's rehabilitation efforts and planning for potential community reintegration. I subsequently transferred to the Winnipeg Parole Office in 2010, where I assumed the role of community parole officer. In this capacity, I continue to assist federal offenders on release in the community with their reintegration, connecting them with interventions, medical professionals, bridging relationships with community partners to support their basic needs, housing, employment, while at the same time actively balancing the needs to ensure public safety through ongoing engagement with their professional and personal supports, utilizing supervision tools to confirm compliance with imposed conditions, and victim considerations, including consultation through the CSC Victim Services Unit. Sometimes this ongoing assessment resulted in federal offenders on parole returning to prison because their risk was too high to remain in the community. In other cases, federal offenders were able to establish sufficient supports to begin a more productive life, avoid recidivism, and reach the expiry of their sentence under supervision. I remained in the role of community parole officer until 2021, when I was elected as a regional vice president for the Union of Safety and Justice Employees. As a regional vice president, I represent hundreds of federal public safety personnel from Northwestern Ontario to British Columbia and north in both urban and rural locations, working for the Correctional Service of Canada and the Parole Board of Canada. As a national union representing over 18,000 federal public service employees across 18 departments and agencies, we are immensely proud of the work Canada's federal public safety personnel undertake day and night, 365 days a year, to keep Canadians safe in every province and territory. Within federal corrections specifically, USJ represents thousands of employees who serve in federal parole and programs, support offenders with education, employment, Indigenous specific interventions, food services, and also undertake maintenance and administrative work. Overwhelmingly, USJ's members are highly dedicated public safety personnel who largely work behind the scenes, often without recognition, to keep Canadians safe day in and day out, sometimes sacrificing their own mental health in the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to get right into questions, and the first round will be 6 minutes each, and we'll start off with Mr. Shipley, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. My first question will be for Mr. Wilkins. Mr. Wilkins, when the shocking Bernardo transfer was finally made public, representatives of your Ontario and Quebec locals stated that they were, quote, baffled by the decision to transfer Bernardo from a maximum to medium security prison. Mike Bolduc, the Quebec region president, said, quote, we didn't even know. It's like it was hidden. We had no idea. Neither the regional president of Ontario nor me knew this guy was getting transferred, end of quote. I have been informed that only 3 officers at Millhaven Institution were told of Bernardo's transfer the night before it happened, and they were instructed to keep the transfer a secret. No one else knew. Why do you feel this transfer was hidden from your members and the public?
Well, thank you for the question. The statements that were made were absolutely correct. And as I highlighted in my opening comments, correctional officers are often not engaged in the case management team in making these decisions, as is a normal practice when you're transferring a high-profile inmate. There is a level of keeping your mouth shut that needs to happen. So those 3 officers that were informed the night before were the escorting officers for the next day. And as far as I'm aware, they're the only people, correctional officers, that knew about the transfer. I had verified once again with the local president. He wasn't informed until the morning that he showed up for work. Why is the question? That's a very good question. I think that when it comes to the case management of that offender, there would have been a CX2 that would have been assigned to his file that should have been in the know as to what was happening to their inmate. But as far as I'm aware, they weren't even aware.
Have you ever seen this in the past where someone was not aware of this transfer of this magnitude?
I have seen this in the past, actually. We have several high-profile inmates that are moved sometimes not just with our members, but with members of our institutional emergency response team. Through the middle of the night, things are kept quiet and nobody seems to know. It's what has been told to me is that these are done for the inmates. That secrecy is for the inmate safety. It's for the public safety, because if these types of things were to get out into the media, then there could be risks involved, and there very well could be.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to move on. You briefly mentioned a case, and I'm going to get into a bit more details for. In 2019, two inmates that had been convicted of violent crimes escaped from the minimum security prison William Head in BC and murdered a local man in his home. After the incident, we learned that corrections officials overruled their security assessment, which stated that they should not be in a minimum security prison and placed them in a cozy minimum security facility anyways. That is sometimes referred to as Club Fed because of its relaxed conditions. Do you consider this case emblematic of the wider systematic issues you've described surrounding the reclassification and transfer of federal offenders in Canada?
Well, thank you for the question. Absolutely, I do. This is one of the biggest problems that we face when it comes to the custody rating scale, as I mentioned in my opening statement. When the decision is made to ignore the empirical data, and I say empirical with quotation marks, using that custody rating scale, and to override inmates that would normally be in a maximum or a medium security institution to go to a lower level of security, that overriding could have potential consequences for the public, as just was in this case. So I know that in the case of Mr. Bernardo, he was overridden, but overridden to stay in a maximum security institution. You typically don't have a whole lot of problem when they're keeping somebody at a higher level, but when the transfer is being made to a lower level, this is where we have problems. And you will see that if you ask the right questions, you'll see that there are many inmates across the country that are in lower level than what they are classified as a custody rating scale.
Thank you. That's a nice lead into my next question, because recently we learned that this year there are a total of 736 dangerous offenders in federal custody, with 99 of those in maximum security, 580 of them in medium security, and 57 dangerous offenders in minimum security prisons. Have members of your union raised concerns about their personal safety regarding the number of dangerous offenders currently in medium and minimum security prisons across Canada?
The quick answer is yes. Absolutely. We hear that, we typically are dealing with those types of things at the labor management tables, either at the local level or the regional level or the national level. Mostly these types of moves are discussed at the regional level. We ask for a review in some cases for the transfer, because our members have come forward with genuine security concerns.
Heath? I've only got a few seconds left. Maybe we can get this in. You did mention that an offender's custody rating scale is determined by an actuarial score that is often overridden by corrections. We're learning a lot about that today, to give offenders a security downgrade. You are saying you feel this practice is dangerous for your members and the Canadian public? Yes,
it absolutely is. In some cases, there's reasons and rationale that's put behind that. But, when we have inmates that are assaulting staff in a medium security institution 1 week and then a few weeks later are being transferred to minimum, we have questions.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkins. Thank you, Mr. Shipley. Now we'll go to Mr. Scheifke.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and allowing us the opportunity to clarify a few things and get some transparency on behalf of Canadians who are looking for answers to some questions with regards to how the process works. And I want to begin my line of questioning with Mr. Wilkins. Just following up on the line of questioning that Mr. Shipley had put forward, can you explain and tell us a little bit more about how the custody rating scale and the security reclassification scale works? Who makes those decisions exactly?
Thank you. Judging by the credentials of my colleagues on the witness panel, they might have a better understanding of the custody rating scale as parole officers or former parole officers. But it's my understanding that the custody rating scale is done by the parole officer. The parole officer weighs, several different factors. There are many factors, and they're each given a point value, whether it's institutional charges or they have community contacts, or their crime to begin with and the brutality of their crime. All of these things weigh into a score, and that score is going to be dependent on whether you're classified as a minimum, a medium, or a maximum security offender.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkins, and I'll pass it along to Mr. Menard and Mr. Sendelli. Could you expand on that, perhaps provide your feedback as well?
Oui, je vais m'exprimer en français. En effet,
Yes, I'll be speaking French. Yes, when a newly sentenced offender comes from the court to a evaluation unit of CSC, so this is a process, the initial assessment process. And at that step, there's a complete collection of information about the offender. And there's a tool that will be used, which is the tool that you're referring to. It's this custody rating scale according to the level of security, and it's based on various factors, as Mr. Wilkins said, which includes the type of crime for which the offender is detained, but also his former record. The tool looks at his previous incarceration. So a detainee who has been incarcerated in the past, be it at the provincial level or federal level, will be taken into account in this tool. The tool gives a result which proposes a level of security. This tool has to be used in parallel with all of the documents that we have at our disposal, the police reports, the court reports, the concerns about the victims, the harm done to the victims, etc. During the incarceration, this security level will be reviewed, and this is done using another tool called the reevaluation of reassessment of the custody rating scale. So it's a tool that's completely different from that used initially. So throughout the sentence, the three primordial criteria to evaluate the level of safety is the risk within the walls, adaptation to the institution, the risk for the public, and the risk of escape.
What role, if any, do parole officers play in working with the CSC to help determine security classifications of an offender? Question I can pose to Mr. Menard. Donc, Monsieur Menard, est-ce que vous pouvez répondre?
Mr. Menard, can you answer this question? Could you please repeat the question? I thought you were asking Mr. Sendelli, so maybe I missed something.
With the CSC to help determine security classifications of an offender.
OK. Alors, en fait, c'est le rôle.
Well, actually, it's the parole officer's role to collect the relevant information, to use the information that is available to them, to make sure that the file is complete, to complete the custody rating scale, that's at the beginning of the sentence, and to issue a final recommendation to the head of the institution in terms of the safety. There's a rating, a security rating that's done, developed, and there's a placement in a penitentiary that's done. And what are the reasons for a normal transfer?
OK. Alors, là, on va prendre.
So now let's look at the scenario of an offender or a detainee halfway through their sentence, and we want to carry out a transfer. There are two types of transfer. Actually, there are three. We'll talk about a voluntary transfer. So the detainee requests a transfer. There's an involuntary transfer. So the correctional service, through the case management team, proceeds to a transfer which is against the offender's will. And there are also the emergency transfers. which are carried for other reasons. And so these are almost always of an involuntary nature. So why would a delinquent or an offender want to be transferred, and why?
We've gone over our time, almost 30 seconds, so I'll move on. But I do want to check with Mr. Sendelli. Can you hear us, Mr. Sendelli? Can you give us a thumbs up if you can hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry, there was some overlap in the translation, and it wasn't clear to me where the question was going. Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you. No, that's fine. We'll go now to Ms. Michaud.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I'm very interested with what Mr. Ménard was saying, so I'll come back to that. But before that, I have 3 things to share with you. First of all, Chair, congratulations on your election. I wasn't there when it took place, but I understand that it was all done in due form. So congratulations for this new position. And then I have a notice of motion to be filed, so I will read it, and it's a notice of motion, so that in conformity with the 128, the committee carries out a study on the issues of security that comes out of the implantation of groups of criminals coming from Mexico and Central and South America who were leading clandestine activities in Canada, especially in Quebec and at the borders, using false passports and false identities, and that traffic migrants, weapons, and proceeds of theft to the U.S., that we carry out the study in order to put an end to this situation which threatens the life, the integrity, and the safety of vulnerable people, and which presents issues of public safety for Quebec and Canada. That the committee devote a minimum of 3 meetings to the study, and that invite the Minister of Immigration and Citizenship, Mr. Mark Miller, the Minister of Public Safety, Dominique Leblanc, representatives of Canada Border Services Agency, representatives of the RCMP, and any other witnesses that the committee will deem relevant, and that the committee shares its recommendations and observations at the House. So the notice of motion has been filed, and I imagine we can debate this at another point. The last thing I wanted to share with you are my most warm sympathy with the families and the people, relatives of the victims. I know that this can stimulate the emergence of delicate memories. So the Bloc will behave in the most sensitive way, and so the questions that will be asked will be the least partisan possible. I think that this topic requires all the compassion that we can provide, and partisan politics has no place in there. So I wanted to give that message for people who are listening to us for the beginning of this study, and continue with questions. So what Mr. Ménard was saying was very interesting. Thank you, dear witnesses, for being here. I think that your advice is very important. I don't know to what point you can give us advice or tell us only the facts about how things happen, but it's interesting to understand these things to go on with the study. And Mr. Ménard, I would like you to continue to talk about the 3 types of transfer that you were talking about, especially the second type with the case management team. In the case that we're dealing with, I don't know if we know the details of that particular transfer and what could lead to this kind of transfer. So maybe I'll just let you go on with what you were saying earlier. Yes, thank you for your question. So we're talking about the classical kind of transfer, which comes from a recommendation of the case management team. So we could have an offender who would like to have access to services in the language of their choice. So this would be a voluntary transfer. An Anglophone wishes to not be detained in Quebec because there aren't sufficient services in English, or vice versa for a French detainee somewhere. But what happens most often is because of access to programs that correspond to the prescriptions in the correctional plan, programs that are related to the risk factors of the offender, the detainee. And at that point, the offender could ask to be transferred in a voluntary way to institution XYZ, which would be offering those programs. That's one thing, but we also have to make sure that the security level is appropriate, so that the program is offered, that's offered in the proper language, and it's related to the criminogenic factors of the detainee, and then the case management team has to study the request of the detainee to know if the reevaluation of the custody rating scale proposes a corresponding level of security. There could be a person who was in a maximal security institution, wants a program offered in a medium security institution, but does the scale correspond to that? And are the three factors to be considered for a new custody rating allow to decrease that, the adaptation to the institution, the risk of escape, and the risk to the public? We have to look at each of these factors to know if the level of risk is low, moderate, or high. And if it's high in terms of adaptation to the institution, or high risk factor of escape or risk to the public, that person will stay in a maximum security institution. Thank you. I think I just have a few seconds. I guess my time has elapsed.
We're going to Mr. Julian, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. And certainly on behalf of the NDP, I wanted to express my condolences to the victims and their families of Mr. Bernardo. We seek to get to get an understanding of what transpired last spring, and I think all members of the committee are united to try to get answers. I wanted to start with you, Mr. Wilkins. Mr. Shipley quoted the news article where Mike Bolduc made comments about the fact that the transfer was, as according to Mr. Bolduc, was hidden, and we had no idea, and we don't know why Mr. Bernardo was transferred. He had two parole hearings, Mr. Bernardo, in 2018 and 2021. Was denied parole both times. Mr. Wilkins, in your experience, is that something that plays a determining role in transfers, or is that something that is not considered?
I wouldn't say that it's not considered, but I don't think that it plays a leading role in the transfer of an inmate. Again, it is the custody rating scale that determines the assessment for decision for that transfer to a lower security institution. And the comment that the union didn't know, as the national president of the organization, I didn't know until it hit the media either.
Now, thank you for your answer. You've referenced the custody rating scale, but you also said in your introductory remarks, and I think I'm quoting here, that many inmates do not meet the customary rating scale for minimum security. Did I understand that correctly, that what you were saying is that there has been an overriding of the scale? In Mr. Bernardo's case, it was overridden to maintain him in maximum security, if I understood correctly. But in many other cases, it's overridden to bring the inmate to a level of security that is lower than their custody rating scale would actually justify. Am I correct in that? And do you have any idea, or could you estimate how many inmates would be impacted by that?
I think that I would be a little premature to give an estimate, but in any one facility, in a minimum security, for example, there would be 5 to a dozen inmates that might be overridden from a medium security. And likewise, from maximum into medium, we have inmates that are overridden and placed in our medium security facilities that are, according to the custody rating scale, would come out as a maximum security offender. The decisions for this, the words that have always been spoken to me are they're a manageable risk. The risk is manageable. Although we've argued on many occasions with the Correctional Service that I don't see in policy anywhere that there's another level of risk under the custody rating scale that talks about being manageable. This is where we have issues. But as for the exact number, I certainly could not tell you the exact number.
You're suggesting 5 to a dozen in each facility. We know how many facilities, so we can estimate with the number of facilities across the country what would be a rough number where this has happened. And if you could tell us how that overriding process takes place. How is it overridden when there is a custody rating scale in place?
Well, once again, my colleagues might be in a better position to answer that question, but it's my understanding that there's different authorities when it comes to different kinds of transfers. So if it's a transfer into within a region from a medium security institution to a minimum security institution, for example, it's the warden's delegated authority to make the decision on that. If they're going outside of region, it's a different delegated authority. If they're moving, if it's somebody that's got a dangerous offender label, it would be a different authority then as well. But what we've seen is it's the warden's authority to after the case management team, who would include the parole officer, has come up with the decision to transfer to a lower security, even though that it might not fall within the custody rating scale. It would be the warden's authority to do so, and they do that. Like I said, the words that are floated around are manageable risk.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais passer à question à Monsieur Ménard.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Mr. Ménard a question. Mr. Ménard, do you agree with what Mr. Wilkins has just said in relation to the number of people who are not necessary in the custody rating scale, who are in an institution with a lower level of security than their custody rating scale? Well, listen, frankly, I don't have that data. My observations over my career, that's all I can tell you. You know, a parole officer, we have a caseload, and in my own career, it went from 25 to, it varied between 25 to 30 offenders, and we can have 2 or 3 cases, so maybe 10% of them had the overriding. That's a very personal estimate.
For additional questions. So we're going to move to the second round, which will be a 5-minute round. For Mr. Lloyd first, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question to Mr. Wilkins. Correctional statistics before the implementation of Bill C-83 showed that the number of inmates in a maximum security facility dropped by as low as 8 or as high as 89 on an annual basis. In 2021, the first full year after C-83 was implemented, that number almost doubled to 158. Now, I've received an ATIP response that states that 505 inmates were transferred out of maximum security to medium security last year, ending March 2023 alone. Now, there are anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 inmates in maximum security in Canada. In your experience, is 505 transfers out of maximum security a high number in any given year?
It seems like a very high number. Now, I'm not exactly sure if this would have been relevant during COVID because we didn't have a lot of transfers happening, if you recall, during the pandemic. I assume that this is after the pandemic, but...
Yeah, so this is 2022 to 2023 fiscal year. There were 505 prisoners moved out of maximum security into medium security. Now, prior to C-83 coming into effect in June 2019, would you consider this a high number compared to the numbers in previous years?
I would.
Okay. In your experience, has the number of prisoner transfers, COVID notwithstanding, from maximum to medium security increased since Bill C-83 was brought into effect in June 2019?
Well, of course, with the elimination of segregation, which we would have had the segregation units in our medium security facilities across the country. And with the SIU model that has been put in place, most of the SIUs are in a maximum security institution. So that is going to increase the number of transfers between medium and maximum, ultimately just because you're moving from a medium security to a maximum security because of the SIU placement, and then back again potentially from the SIU placement. So absolutely, the introduction of the SIU model has increased the amount of movement between institutions across the country. There's no doubt about that.
Do you also attribute the addition under C-83 of the so-called least restrictive principle as partially responsible for this trend?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Inmates have the ability to file what's called a habeas corpus suit, saying that they're not being housed in the appropriate level according to their custody rating scale, for example. So, of course, the least restrictive is something that Correctional Service is always trying to strive towards. So that might mean movement between institution and institution.
Do you believe that this least restrictive principle, as enshrined in C-83, contributed to the reclassification of Paul Bernardo from a maximum to a medium security facility?
I'm quite certain that before Bill C-83 that there was something in the CCRA that talked about least restrictive, because I remember making the argument many times as even a local president that inmates that would normally be placed in segregation at the time, this is before Bill C-83, they were being placed in different ranges and different population management strategies occurring for those offenders. My example at the time was, there's general population and there's segregation. There is no other population. And if they can't be managed in general population, then they'd have to be in segregation. But I was always quoted.
I was reading your guys' 2018 submission on Bill C-83, and your recommendation was that the current language was the most appropriate restrictions, not the least restrictive. So it was not the least restrictive, it was the most appropriate restrictions. And so the introduction of these least restrictive, we've certainly seen through the review that was conducted after this transfer that had an impact. In your experience, when Paul Bernardo was denied reclassification in June of 2022, but then according to the review report, they changed their decision in July of 2022, just a month later. Is this a normal practice for them to change a decision just in 1 month?
I can't really speak to the decision that was made, particularly for the case management team at the time. And to be quite honest, I'm not involved that heavily into case management of every individual offender across the country as the national president of the union. I wouldn't say it's abnormal that type of thing would happen, but I wouldn't say that it was normal, that it's an everyday occurrence either.
We'll move on to Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Wilkins, you were correct when you said that there was, previous to C-83, language that would have allowed for reclassification. It was actually in the 90s under Brian Mulrooney that first used the term least restrictive. So this issue has actually been going on for successive governments in terms of language, and it wasn't actually C-83. So your memory served you correct where there has been back and forth, but at least restrictive, again, was actually created by or introduced by Brian Mulrooney, and the same language actually existed under the previous Conservative government, Stephen Harper. So this suggestion that it was somehow this change that C-83 brought forward that created new language is just simply false, and I think that needs to be put on the record. In addition to that, Mr. Chair, I think there is sometimes misperceptions about what maximum, medium, and minimum security classifications mean. It's not a conditions of punishment or a situation based on an outcome of the court case of whatever the offender has committed and been found guilty of, but about safety, public safety at large, and the risk of escape. And Mr. Shipley brought up escapes, but he conveniently left out some data, so I wanted to put that on the record. In 2006-2007, there were 37 federal prison escapees in Canada. 2007-2008, 33. 2008-2009, 24. 2009-2010, 31. 2010 to 2011, 17. The list goes on. Next year, 16, 24, 13, 15, 18. In 2016, it went down to 9. Then 2017, 18. Then 2018, 19, it went to 13 escapees. And it has actually consistently gone down. From 2019 to 2020, there were 12. 2020 to 2021, there were 11. So the suggestion that C-83 has opened up this new least restrictive measure is frankly false. That was introduced by Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservative government. The suggestion that classifications have led to prisoner escapees actually there's been fluctuations, but the highest number was in 2006-2007 with 37 escapees. And so I want to, with those facts on the record, because that really matters if we're going to talk about classification and security levels. Mr. Wilkins, you spoke about, corrections officers and their role, and I would be very happy. You said you have suggestions on how your union's members' voices can be part of that ongoing consultation, because I think there are improvements that need to be made here. And so I would be happy to receive them as a committee for any recommendations on that. But I'd also like to ask the question of, the Conservatives have proposed a system through a private member's bill that would actually see the entirety of a prisoner's or an inmate's classification. If it starts at maximum, it stays that way. And there would be no opportunity for good behavior, for rehabilitation mechanisms. Do your members have concerns of their own safety if there are no interventions for rehabilitation and for measures to be put in place for good behavior and promoting that sort of program in facilities? A larger risk to your members if there was no opportunity for rehabilitation and programming?
What I could say is that when it comes to rehabilitative programming, it's much easier conducted inside of a medium security institution or a minimum security institution. There is some strict level of controls when it comes to inmate movement inside of a maximum security facility, and having that ability for a medium security institution is certainly a little bit easier. And I do believe that you're never going to hear from the Union of Canadian Correctional Officers that programming is a bad thing. Idle hands are the devil's playground inside of an institution, and we want to make sure that the inmates are busy, day in and day out, whether it's through school or whether it's through program or whether it's through some sort of work.
We'll move on to Ms. Michaud.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to come back on the assessment process for the custody rating scale. What I've heard, I've heard that it's not necessarily the members of the unions who are doing this, but I would like to know I'd like to talk about these assessments that the parole officers will do. There's no secret that there's overload of work at the system. So the 2019, the Justice Department indicated clearly that there was excessive workload. And there were several articles. I'll read an excerpt because I think there's an excerpt that could be drawn with the people who are in charge of these assessments in the system. So in May 2019, in the press, and I think it's still current. I've had discussions with the unions over the past few months, so I think that it is relevant. The parole officers of Canada say that the correctional system of the country is at a critical point because of an insurmountably high workload, and it's a problem for public safety. A survey by the Justice Department of parole officers showed that more than 2/3 of the agents are worried about not being able to protect the public sufficiently because they cannot assess, they cannot do their work. So many of these offenders will pass through the safety net. And so the national vice president of the union says that this comes from budget cuts made by the former Conservative government, which reduced the number of staff and led to this too high workload. And so help needed for people with mental health problems also have made this overly high workload happen. So detainees should be evaluated properly in terms of risk, in terms of their release. We're talking about two distinct things, but I'd like to know, Mr. Ménard, is that still a problem for parole officers? Can we draw this connection with the parole officers or the people who are carrying out the custody rating scale assessments for detainees? Is there workload that's much too high that could harm public safety?
Perhaps someone else will lead into the similar question. Mr. Julian, please.
And I will, Mr. Chair, because I think it's fair to say that our parole officers and our classification officers, the members of both the unions that are represented today, do an incredible job under very, very difficult circumstances. They have had to deal with workplace issues, mental health, the concerns that are raised every day. It's a workplace environment that is very, very difficult. And that's why I tabled on September 20th Bill C-357, an act to amend the Government Employees Compensation Act that will allow for presumptive injury classification for federal correctional workers of the Union of Safety and Justice Employees, also for the Union of Canadian Correctional Officers, so that they are covered by this. I wanted to ask both our witnesses to what extent the federal government should be providing additional resources, adopting bills like the one that I've tabled on behalf of the Union of Safety and Justice Employees, so that your members that do such valuable work can work in a workplace that is safe and allows them to continue to make their contributions to Canadians.
I think I can speak to that. Thanks very much for the question, as well as for Bill 357 and that reference. I think it's exceedingly important that as we do this work that's critical to protecting Canadians' safety, which is what our members do behind the scenes, with not many folks understanding the work that's being done. Certainly the resourcing is a huge issue. When there's a lack of resource, it adds extensive pressure to our members that are in these institutions, in the community parole offices, the community correctional centers, undertaking this work, frontline work, support level work. Everybody's impacted by this work. It's stressful work to begin with, and certainly the potential for operational stress injuries is high to begin with in corrections. We know this. However, without proper resourcing, it's even more so, and it's compounding. And that I think we know that in order to have proper assessment, proper outcomes, we're going to need to have healthy public safety personnel. And we've been calling on all parties to support the contents of Bill 357 as it relates to the modifications of GECA, the Government Employee Compensation Act, so that all federal public safety employees are treated equally across our country. Currently, it's at the discretion. GECA hands down that assessment to the individual provinces. And as a result, our members aren't treated equally, and they aren't presumed to get coverage in all provinces the same way. That means that a member in one province might be getting presumptive coverage for their injury, whereas in another province, they may not. It's not fair, and it doesn't leave us in a good position as we continue to see more of our USJE members going
Mr.
off on stress
Julian.
injury.
Thank you. Now we're going to move on to Ms. Thomas, I believe, for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. Sure, I will direct my first questions here to Mr. Wilkins. Look, so Paul Bernardo, we know that he was a serial rapist and murderer. We know that he did things that were absolutely vile, absolutely disgusting. He was described as, quote, a sexually sadistic psychopath. And then we know that during his time in prison, which, you know, I'm talking about his time in a maximum security prison, he was assessed every 2 years, a total of 14 times. The last one being in June 2022. Only 1 month later, of course, the decision was overturned and he was moved to a lower security prison. However, up until that point, 14 times, it had been determined by the parole board that he was not fit to be moved. And the reason was because of this. In the parole board's decision, in their report, they said this: there was no remorse, empathy, or insights into his crimes demonstrated by Mr. Bernardo. Further to that, he was found with contraband in his cell 3 times. He was found with a razor, and he was found with a weapon. Further to that, he also attacked a guard and of course caused harm in that matter as well. This is an individual in a maximum security prison. He also, of course, was designated a dangerous offender. And so my question for you is very simple. Does this sound like someone who should be moved from a maximum security prison to a medium security prison?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. When it comes to the level of violence from Mr. Paul Bernardo, I will reiterate your comments that they are unspeakable. The damage that he's done to the Canadian society is unspeakable. Whether he belongs in a medium security institution, I think that we need to generalize that question a little bit broader, because we have many, many, many offenders in our prison systems in medium security institutions across the country that have committed unspeakable crimes, similar types of crimes, sexual related crimes. There's designated dangerous offenders in our medium security institutions, some in our minimum security institutions. All of these processes are weighed on an individual basis when making decisions.
I'm going to interrupt you. I understand. I understand that every case is weighed individually. I'm asking specifically about Mr. Bernardo. In your estimation, is he someone who should have been moved to a medium security prison, based on the facts that I just listed?
I'm going to not be able to comment on the question, to be honest, because I'm not part of his case management team. I never have been. I don't know the entire case. Does it sound like somebody that belongs in a medium security institution, I think, is the crux of the question? I don't believe so. But then we have to look at many across the country that are inside of our
Mr. Wilkins, here's what we know. We know that in a medium security prison that more of the officers are women. In fact, up to 90% more of the officers are women in a medium facility versus a maximum security. We know that his hours of being unsupervised have increased or will increase. And his opportunity for escape has also increased. Now, you're someone who advocates on behalf of those that are maintaining the safety and security of these institutions and therefore looking out for the best needs of the public. Do you believe that this individual should be in a medium security prison? Do you want him around your correctional officers?
Again, I think that our correctional officers, our members, are dealing with these types of inmates across the country every single day, 24/7, every single day of the year. I know that we want to sensationalize this particular inmate, but this is the reality inside of our medium security institutions. We have many offenders that are just like that. And just to back up on the statistic about females in the difference between females and males, the ratio in maximum security and medium, I don't believe that that one is true. We're very close in our maximum security institutions and our medium security institutions for employment equity based on gender profile.
My understanding is that program officers, they are 90% women. Are you saying that's not true?
Program officers or correctional officers?
I'm saying program officers right now.
Oh, I wouldn't be able to speak to the program officers. I just speak about my membership. But when it comes to correctional officers, the profile between maximum security and medium security when it comes to that employment equity profile is very close in most of our institutions across the country.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkins. Ms. Thomas, we're going to move on to...
I was timing that and I have 55 seconds left.
There you go.
I pressed it right when I started asking my questions.
You're over 16 seconds, was it, when I stopped you? I let everybody go a little over.
Okay.
We'll move on now to Mr. Gahir, please.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before the committee. I wanted to take some notes from the Attorney General's report on systemic racism within Correctional Services Canada. We know that for every offender that's admitted into custody, correction staff are to assess using the custody rating scale to determine the offender's security level. We found that correction staff had actually overridden the result recommended by the custody rating scale 30% for 30% of all the security assessments, with half of them being for a higher level of security and half of them being for a lower level of security. So I think, first of all, the allegation that there's a soft on crime approach, I think that's a little bit ridiculous. But my question, I guess, to the witnesses is, what would lead to, a correction staff to override the security rating scale?
I don't mind adding a little bit, but I'll certainly allow Patrick to have the more time as he has much more institutional experience. But I think it must be said that in any assessment that's taking place, it's a global assessment. So it's not reliant on just one aspect of the case. It isn't just focused on historical and individual crime. They look at a number of topics, whether you're doing security classification and you're making a recommendation to a decision maker, or you're making recommendations to the Parole Board of Canada, you're collecting information from a number of sources, whether they're historical documents or they're ones that are progressive documents, and that's what's leading to the assessment. I'll pass it to Patrick, though, for more.
Oui, exactement. Alors,
Yes, exactly. So the file is looked at in its entirety, and the tools that are used to get the result, be it the custody rating scale that we carry out at the beginning of the sentence, or when they return to institutions if they've failed in the community, or the reassessment, the reclassification of the rating scale done at a minimum every 2 years. So that is looked at in parallel with all the other data which are related to the three factors: the risk within the walls, the risk of escape, and the risk for public safety. So the largest characteristic of people in medium security institutions in relation to maximum, it's in terms of the risk within the institution that it shows. So that is the adaptation in the institution, which will almost always lead to a detainee being placed in medium security rather than maximum. Whatever the custody rating scale has given. So I'll give an example. A quiet detainee in medium security participates in the programs, that we find them with 100 pounds of cocaine and weapons. Even though the scale says medium security, he'll be reevaluated to maximum. So the tool can't calculate everything because there are way too many factors to be taken into account. There are exceptions, there will be exceptions. And that's why our members, our parole officer members, are humans who have to make these recommendations. Otherwise, we'd just use a tool that we'd use, and there would not be any members, any professionals who would be taking into account the whole situation. The tools reflect only a part of the data. So those are science. The tool is and it seems that it's exact. So. But it's the correctional services that has the tool. We work with the tools that we're given. That's what I'd like to say.
Chair, how much time do I have left?
5 seconds.
So I'll ask the question, and maybe it can be answered at a later point. From the AG's report, we know that there are disparities within the system from the moment that offenders enter federal institutions. When we look at the results, there's a disproportionately high number of Indigenous and Black offenders being placed in maximum security institutions, with the majority of offenders will eventually receive parole before the end of their sentences. We see that Indigenous and Black offenders remain in custody longer and at higher levels of security before the release. So I think my question is going to be, how do we make this process more fair? Because I do have hesitations with this process. Thank you.
Time's up, so you can hold that question for a little later. So we're going to move on to Mr. Baldinelli, please. We're going into the third round, so Mr. Baldinelli for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here this afternoon. These hearings are important as we try to make sense of a horrible decision that I think we can all agree should not have taken place, and that this committee can come forward with recommendations to see that this type of decision never happen again. You know, the name Paul Bernardo is synonymous with evil in our community, and this decision has had the effect of re-victimizing the families as they've had to relive this horrific memory because of I would suggest, the uncompassionate and short-sighted process from Correctional Services of Canada with regards to the transferring of inmates. The impact of this decision and these horrific crimes were felt most in our communities, and that of my colleague as well here in Niagara. And, you know, and it led to friends of Christian French contacting my office to see if ways could be found to ensure this type of decision be reversed and never happen again, and which led to my establishment and creation of a private members bill 342, which would require all court-ordered dangerous offenders and mass murderers be permanently assigned a maximum security classification. It would also repeal the Liberals' least restrictive environment standard for assigning inmates to prisons and restore the language of necessary restrictions that the previous Conservative government had put in place. My Conservative colleague, MP Genereux, also has a private members bill that is coming forward and to be debated quite soon. It's Bill C-351, and that will amend the Correction and Conditional Release Act to require that inmates who have been found to be dangerous offenders or convicted of more than one first-degree murder be assigned a security classification of maximum and confined in a maximum security penitentiary or area in a penitentiary. So those are actions that we can take, and I hope with the support of all colleagues in the House that those types of legislation can come forward and be implemented. First, I'd like to go to Mr. Wilkins, if I could. Correctional Services of Canada's report on the transfer of Paul Bernardo from maximum to medium security revealed that he had only just integrated for 4 months before his transfer was approved, after refusing to integrate with the general population for almost 30 years. He was denied a transfer earlier in the year, and one of the explicit reasons for that denial was that he was not fully integrated. In fact, the review committee's main concern about the transfer was that there was no detailed rationale of how the period of 4 months was sufficient to begin to reassess institutional adjustment. Mr. Wilkins, in your experience, have you seen this type of transfer occur before with such a short period of integration of only 4 months?
Well, I would like to say I think that the case of Mr. Bernardo is a little bit unique when it comes to his sentence overall. So it's not very often you see a case like his. Whether the integration of 4 months was an appropriate measure or it wasn't, look, I think that judging by the amount of time that somebody would be integrating would be a little bit more beneficial in the argument. Perhaps 4 months was certainly not enough. My question, and the one that I still don't really have a complete answer to, is what input my membership as correctional officers witnessing him on the floor, what reports were submitted, what reports were taken into consideration. And of course, these are things that we're looking at on our side, because it's our members that are monitoring those daily movements. It's not members of the case management team. It's our members that are monitoring that integration, and I have questions around that.
Mr. Wilkins, if I could, like those reports that your members do, are they then used in part of the determination of custody rating scale? Are they used, in fact?
It is our hope that they are. This is, again, one where we run into some problems when it comes to decisions to move into lower classifications, because I'll be receiving feedback from our members that, listen, I wrote 2 reports on that inmate, whatever the inmate's name might be, last week. He assaulted another inmate, and they moved him today. I don't understand. These are the types of things that we hear quite often. When it comes to the custody rating scale. So whether they're taken into account, it is our hope that they are, but whether they are or they aren't is, like I said, we're not significant members in that case management team in that decision-making process. So
you suggest perhaps in some of the recommendations that we make, some of your comments just there with regards to the comments and input of staff be considered as part of that custody rating scale?
Absolutely. Not only when it comes to the custody rating scale, but when it comes to population management conversations that happen locally, regionally, and nationally.
Welcome, Mr. Baldinelli. I appreciate it. Now we're moving back to Liberals with Mr. Biddle, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I was wondering if I could ask my first question to the Union of Safety and Justice Employees. I was wondering if you can comment on the importance of independence in the system, and that these decisions are made by corrections professionals and not politicians.
Je peux parler. Je peux débuter.
I could answer. I could start, rather. Listen, the professionals that we represent obviously want a maximum of independence and autonomy in the recommendations that they make. That's what we want. And I would say that public safety is a very sensitive topic. And we really feel the changes of government. The policies, the laws don't change. The commissioner's directives are reevaluated from time to time. That happens progressively. But when the government changes, there are changes in vision. And yes, it goes all the way to the base, and it can have an influence on the professionals working in the field. But our members must have the minimum of impact because of this. Because if the policies don't change, the laws don't change, the work has to remain independent.
Direct my next question to Mr. Wilkins. I'm new to the committee and a little bit ignorant on the differences between the maximum and medium security. I was wondering if you can explain to the committee what are the main differences between a maximum security institution and a medium security institution.
Sure, I'll try to be quick because I know we're probably running out of time. But when it comes to a maximum security institution, of course, this is either a walled or a fenced institution that is has a perimeter patrol, an armed perimeter patrol. But there's also weapons on the inside of a maximum security institution. There's gallery officers that are providing, the utmost coverage for any area of the institution, whether it's the programs area, the school area, the recreation area. Inside of a medium security, there is no weapons on the inside of a medium security institution. There still is a perimeter, a secure perimeter, but we rely a whole lot more on dynamic security as opposed to static security inside of a medium security. In minimum, there's no fence typically around any minimum security institution. Inmates have the ability to walk away if they so choose. They typically don't, but it's more suited for inmates that are coming near the end of their sentence or inmates that are serving short sentences for nonviolent crimes.
I was wondering if you, in terms of the public safety and the perimeter between maximum and medium security, I was wondering if you can elaborate on the difference between those two classifications.
On the perimeter security?
Yes.
Well, each would be controlled by a mobile patrol truck that would be armed. In most maximum security institutions, there would also be tower officers that are positioned in towers, which we would not have in a medium security institution. But both are very similar in the perimeter security. It's the internal security that is different between the two.
Okay. I think I only have about 30 seconds left, so I don't know that I'll get into another question. I do appreciate everyone being here and want to echo my colleagues about the importance of discussing this issue. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We're going to move to Ms. Michaud for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je veux
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to give Mr. Ménard the opportunity to answer my long question earlier about the officers being overtasked. This excessive workload is a problem that has existed always. I began my career in 1989. It was already there. So for parole officers within institutions, their workload is calculated by the number of detainees by agent, and that number has just increased over the years. And when the ratios are established, they're often not respected. Outside, in the community, it's a frequency of contact that determines the workload. So for the workload, different reports have to be written and a minimum of contacts in the community. So in the community, it's the workload is measured by a tool which actually counts the amount of time that parole officers work. So that issue is very important for us. And you'll understand that the cases increase. The numbers are higher, the cases, more and more cases, and the employer, Correctional Service Canada, asks us to consider more and more factors that are related to each case. It can be the ethnicity, it could be the mental health status. So many variables have to be taken into consideration that make reports and contacts even more complex. Thank you. We were talking specifically about parole officers who are evaluating or assessing detainees as to discharge. But the same thing could happen to parole officers doing these evaluations related to transfer of detainees. Are these distinct teams, or could there also be an excessive workload for these people as well, and that would indirectly have an impact on public safety? As to the decisions made, it's the same parole officer that will make a recommendation for a transfer who will later write a recommendation for a temporary release and then later for discharge. So each time the recommendation must be made according to the whole file. So all the important aspects of the file. So I will stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Menard. We'll move to Mr. Julian, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I wanted to come back to you, Mr. Wilkins. I think we would all agree that prison escapes pose a threat to public safety. I don't think no one would disagree with that. I would like you perhaps to react to what are the factors that increase the number of prison escapes that we've had in the past, and what do you attribute to the lower level that we're seeing currently of prison escapes? Is it a factor of resources? If a government cuts back on services, does that make a difference? What are the factors that we need to be considering?
I certainly wish that I had the answer to your question and how to prevent escapes from I mean, these are each individual choices that are made by inmates. I don't know how, we assess fluctuations from year to year based on different variables that are associated with institutions. To be quite frank, I don't have the answer to that question.
Thank you very much. I just note, and I think this is important for the public record, that the 5 worst years for prison escapes were all under the former Harper Conservative government, and I think that's something that we need to reflect on in terms of public safety and the record of the government. J'aimerais passer maintenant la parole à vous, Monsieur Menard.
I would now like to give you the floor, Mr. Menard. Earlier, I asked you a question about the types of classification that are the subject of overrides. In your experience, does it often happen? We heard potentially that it could be around 10% of detainees where the custody rating scale result is overridden by someone within correctional services. It could be by the warden of an institution. Have you, in your experience, has that happened very often in this way? No, it doesn't happen often, because the general rule is that the files hold a certain trend, so the parole officers are able to work with the offenders by anticipating a little bit what will happen, because we're aware of the trends. It is an offender accumulating violations within the institution? Are there many incidents? Is the offender participating in programs? Is there daily use? So we can anticipate what will happen.
Merci, Monsieur Menard. Mr. Lloyd, now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Wilkins, I have a copy of your organization's submission to this committee back in 2018 when we were first reviewing C-83, and I note that your third request was, quote, the reversion of language that now recommends response options be, quote, least restrictive to what was previously, quote, most appropriate. The fact is that prior to C-83, the term least restrictive was not in the CCRA. It was actually changed in 2012 under a conservative government, under the Safer Streets and Communities Act, where we removed the term least restrictive and replaced it with the most appropriate or the necessary restrictions. But I find it interesting in reading the report, the review report that CSC released over the summer in response to the Bernardo transfer. It's very interesting to me because it says, I'm quoting here, Millhaven Institution developed a plan for institutional integration, and these efforts were part of an institutional management strategy to establish cohorts with the underlying goal of alleviating subpopulation pressures and to provide a, quote, less restrictive environment for offenders. Now, previous to C-83, was there a requirement for prisons, federal penitentiaries, to have strategies to create a less restrictive environment for offenders?
In fact, there was, and I know that I had actually myself been involved in a refusal to work situation before Bill C-83 because there was subpopulations being created like I iterated earlier, with what would normally have been classified as segregated inmates, mostly inmates that would have been segregated for protective custody reasons. And there was areas of the institution, specific ranges that were associated that had different movement routines and different, so they couldn't associate with the general population. So the CSE was in fact then housing inmates in a least restrictive means.
Interesting, because it seems to be from this review that it was a direct result of Millhaven's institution's implementation of this strategy to achieve a less restrictive environment for offenders that led to the reversal of the decision back in June of 2022, which had previously said that Mr. Bernardo had not integrated and that there was a risk to him in the prison. But because of this strategy to achieve a less restrictive environment, and that's their exact words, less restrictive environment, that he was then able to integrate and thus was able to be reclassified as medium security, under a medium security classification. I also find it interesting that, during that time, there was a meeting with the Office of the Correctional Investigator, and the Office of the Correctional Investigator seemed to have some sort of intervention between July of 2022 and November of 2022 when the actual decision on the reclassification was made. And it seems that the Office of the Correctional Investigator was working to try to speed up the process to achieve this reclassification. Is that something that you think happened, that you've noticed happening often in our institutions?
No, I have not.
Somewhat unprecedented that the Office of the Correctional Investigator would intervene to try to speed up a reclassification process?
It's strange to me. I can't say that I've heard that in my 21-year career as a correctional officer. I understand that the correctional investigator, I think, might be a witness on this panel. I think it would be a good question suited for that gentleman.
Do you think it's somewhat unprecedented that Correctional Services Canada, after making a decision in June of 2022, would so rapidly change its decision just 4 months later in November? Is that something that you think is precedented?
I wouldn't say it's precedent. As I mentioned before, I think this particular inmate is a little bit unprecedented in the way that throughout the system and throughout his incarceration has been handled. To be honest, we don't have many inmates that mirror that exactly. So,
well, he is and certainly a specific inmate, and I just find it absolutely stunning that Correctional Services Canada would change its decisions so rapidly for this particular inmate. I think it is quite unprecedented for an inmate of his notoriety for this to happen, and that's something that I'm very curious about, and I hope that this committee can delve deeper into that and the reasons for why that happened. Thank you, and I think that's my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd. And now we'll move to Ms. O'Connell, please, for 5.
Thank you, Chair. And let me correct the record once again. I'm going to quote to deal with the misinformation Mr. Lloyd just put on the record. Quoting from a Globe and Mail article, it wrote, however, a spokesperson for Public Safety Canada says Bernardo's transfer would have happened under the previous wording of the law, which was brought in by former Conservative government Stephen Harper. The version of the law stipulated that prisoners should be kept in prisons with the, quote, necessary restrictions when the law was originally created by former Progressive Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney in the early 90s that used the term least restrictive. The result of this transfer was not affected by the passage of Bill C-83. A transfer would have occurred under the previous language of necessary restrictions, end quote, said the public safety spokesperson. So, Mr. Chair, while the members opposite giggled and talked through that, I see why, because they want to act tough on crime, but actually don't have the facts to back it up, because it was actually 2 Conservative governments that had the language least restrictive and necessary that would have still allowed for this particular transfer. So if we're going to talk about how to make changes to create a safer public safety conditions in corrections, then we should at least be dealing with facts and not the fiction created by the Conservatives. And so they can giggle because they haven't had a great outing here today. So my last question I want to actually put forward to Mr. Sendelli. You spoke about, in your opening remarks, programming and some of the programming work that your members do, and thank you for that, because I'm sure it is incredibly difficult and the weight that is felt by you and your members. But this study is looking at all prisoner classification and transfers and not just one individual. And in a lot of those instances, even dangerous offenders, there may one day be a day where they serve their time based on a court decision and have to then be released into the public. How would you feel, from a public safety perspective, if an offender who served their time went from maximum security with no programming, no rehabilitation, directly into the community? Do you think that would make our communities safer?
Thanks for the question, and with reference to my intro as well, I think that our members work exceedingly hard at the interventions, and we work within a system that's been designed and is predicated on a scenario where when an offender enters into the system, they're going to be offered opportunities to rehabilitate or learn different ways of thinking in order that they might make that transition. So in an ideal circumstance, if they start in a medium or whether they start in a maximum, it is hoped that they can transition down and cascade through medium and into minimum while having these interventions and making changes, all along the way being assessed by a parole officer in a global manner. So they're taking into consideration the program reports that are being written by the program officers, anything that might come out of the psychological department, out of the educational department, in addition to the empirical measures that are put in place. If they are successful in moving through that into the community, we have seen that they generally are more successful because they are preparing to re-enter into society after being institutionalized. It's a real thing, and it takes time to work through it. And we know that their foray into the community during the first 30 days is extremely stressful. And we see the best results for those that achieve a day parole, typically through cascading through the system. So based on the way our system is designed, that's the manner in which our members work through the policies and the commissioner's directives that are in place. And if there's any changes to those or how those work, however those changes come, it is our hope that the resources follow so that we can appropriately intervene and provide the guidance and support that they need to continue working through that model.
Sorry, I'm assuming I'm out of time. Okay, so then with that being said, is it not also a factor that the work that you do, that let's say you mentioned day parole, that if an individual is not meeting those conditions, that can then actually put them back into the system and keep Canadians safe by not having them just released without any sort of assessment?
Again, the purpose is that there's going to be ongoing assessment and recommendations to decision makers, and if that is not supported, the parole officer can recommend that they are granted or that they are not. And it's up to a decision maker to then do that with conditions or as it works through the institutional security level.
Thank you for your answer, and thank you, Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you.
So we're moving into the fourth round, and I was obviously being a little generous in the first three. The next round, I'm going to be a hard stop on your time, so just to give you a forewarning. Mr. Shipley, you're up. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to lead off by just talking about, there's been a lot of talk around here about we're going to try and make this a nonpartisan issue. I haven't heard once from this side of the table the word liberal get put out. I haven't heard the word Prime Minister Justin Trudeau get put out. I haven't heard a lot of talk like that. But from the other side of the table, I'm hearing about prime ministers that around 20, 30, 40 years ago. We're talking about partisanship. I think it's absolutely just disgusting what I'm hearing here today. We're here to solve problems that are going on today. We're not here to talk, but I hear on the other side, glibness. I brought up a concrete example of a horrific crime that happened when two people were escaped from a minimum security offense. Just to hear someone on the other side, the liberal side, I'll say it because we've been being called conservatives all day, from the liberal side, talk about how, they're doing such a great job with less escapes. So how about we phone the family of them and tell them how great a job you're doing with the less escapes as they've lost a loved one. I don't think you're listening too much right now, Ms. O'Connell, but I'm still talking. So I'm just kind of a little disgusted with this. We're here today to talk
Point
about
of order.
victims' rights
Point of order,
and
Mr.
carry
Chair.
on.
Mr. Chair, if Mr. Shipley wants to take personal shots at me while I'm coordinating who is speaking next, that's his prerogative. But if he has a real question for witnesses who are here, I suggest he ask it, or else it seems he
Is this
just
a
has
point of
nothing
order,
to say other
Chair?
than take some attacks,
Can we-
because
thank
all
you,
of
Mr.
their facts
Point of
have
order.
been
Thank you.
incorrect.
Point of order.
Of order.
Sorry, Ms. O'Connell is out of line. Mr. Chair, I would ask that you would bring that in line, please.
Thank you.
Out of respect for this entire committee.
Thank you. Could we get back to Mr. Shipley and your question?
Yeah,
So
my
the
question's
witness,
coming
thank you.
through here loud and clear. I've just got a few more things left to say because I've sat here and we've taken a lot of partisan shots coming from that way, and it's interesting now we get the point of orders when one's coming back at their way. But it's been an hour and a half of hearing nothing but partisanship coming this way, and enough's enough. So as I said, you know, if the escapes are really going down and that one's not important, but I think it is. I think our whole topic here today is rights of victims of crime. I don't think we've talked enough about that. What I would like to know too, there's been alluding on the other side as to, you know, perhaps inmates can get cascaded down through the system. I really hope there's not any kind of thoughts there that Bernardo is going to cascade through and be let go, because if that's what you're alluding to, that's just horrific. I hope he never sees the light of day. I'd like to ask our witnesses, at the very beginning of this, I talked about the secrecy of this event and how no one knew about it, and there was only 3 people who knew about it at Millhaven to transfer him. How can your staff possibly get prepared for the intake of a horrific criminal like this if no one at the receiving end of it would know he was coming? Mr. Wilkins?
Well, thank you for the question. It is very, I think that you can understand the media sensation that went along with this decision. And of course, when nobody's prepared for it, it makes it extremely difficult, not only to receive the inmate, but again, it's leaving our members with questions, I am certain, from the sending institution as to perhaps why some reports weren't taken into consideration in making these decisions, why staff weren't, you know, his CX2, for example, which would be in charge of his case at a ground floor level. Whether they were informed, I think it makes it very difficult for everybody, because now you're not only juggling the intake of an offender, you're juggling you know, the media that comes along with it.
Thank you for that, Mr. Wilkins. So what we are trying to say here today, and what we're here to try to resolve, is there were issues with this transfer. There are issues. There is and was public outrage. You're agreeing that there were issues around it, and we may not solve them all here today, but at least that's our job, to try and resolve them. So thank you for being here today, and I believe that's it for me for time. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Mr. Gear, please.
Great. Thank you, Chair. I'll ask my question again that I had rushed to ask last time. When we look at the Attorney General's report on systemic racism within Correctional Service Canada, we know that there are disparities present from the moment that the offenders will enter federal institutions. We know that the process for assigning security classifications, including the use of the custody rating scale, which we've talked about at this committee, and the frequent overrides of the scale by correction staff, this results in a disproportionately high number of Black and Indigenous offenders being placed in maximum security institutions. We know that while the majority of offenders will receive parole before the end of their sentences, we see the data shows that Indigenous and Black offenders remained in custody for a longer period of time and at higher levels of security. So I just wanted to ask the witness panel what their thoughts are on this data, what their thoughts are on a more fair process, and how we can achieve that more fair process.
Je peux
Anyone
me
from the
prononcer
committee?
sur la question. Oui, je peux me prononcer.
I could answer this question. Our members, especially the correctional program officers and also our parole officers, are specifically trained on ethnic issues, ethnic questions. This is training they receive regularly. It comes back every year or every 2 years because we know of these statistics in the system. Our members are aware of this. And the training is given to increase their sensitivity to those issues and to take into consideration specificities that can be ethnic differences that can exist between various ethnic groups, to take these into consideration and to weigh these variables in the recommendations that they provide to the people who make the decisions. So it's the ultimate objective is to try and eliminate this discrimination, which can be unconscious, to educate our members and to keep the same level of professionalism. Our members are not working to make statistics. Maybe the organization has some statistic targets, but our members are trained to increase their sensitivity to these factors and to be as fair as possible in their recommendations. Thank you.
Sure. So just a different line of questioning. When transfers happen, what happens when there's interregional transfers? Does the offender receive a new parole officer? Do they keep their existing one? Is some of that institutional knowledge transferred from region to region? What happens in that kind of a case?
Lors d'un transfert d'un établissement à un autre.
So in the transfer from one institution to another, be it the same region or another region, there's an entire change of team. So the detainee will have a new parole officer, a new CX2 also, and a whole number of new members around him. So the detainee does not have the same staff people around him.
When a transfer occurs for a parole officer, in terms of the introduction of that new person to that population of that of another prison.
Vous voulez dire
Do you mean when there is a transfer, what's the responsibility between the former parole officer and the new parole officer?
Oui, la bonne pratique, c'est que...
So the good practice is that there's communication between the two teams. There's a form of transferring the files and transfer of relevant information. It's the same practice that's used between institutions and the community when we're talking about release. So it's a good practice for transfers and also for release. So in practice, this is what our members do.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Menard. Now we'll move on to Ms. Michaud, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So after the transfer of Paul Bernardo, I have a question in terms of the right to privacy as compared to the rights of the victims. A question for Mr. Wilkins and Mr. Menard. So in this specific case, the former Minister of Public Safety, Mr. Mendicino, had said that the Canadians have the right to know why CSC carried out such a transfer. And CSC said that they had the obligation to protect the privacy of the detainee, and a spokesperson for Correctional Service said that under the Privacy Act, an independent organization cannot disclose personal information about a detainee without their consent, except in specific circumstances. I don't know if you could tell us about these specific circumstances and why can some information be given, notifying the families of the victims? How does that process take place generally?
Perhaps I could make a comment to start. When it comes down to the privacy concerns, I can honestly say that this is the first time in my 21 years that I've ever publicly spoken an inmate's name. It's something that we're taught when we join the service, that the privacy concerns of the inmate is paramount. We are not supposed to tell our friends and family. In fact, even in my labor management committee meetings, we don't typically speak individual inmate names. But the privacy concerns, I think, are generally for a wide variety of reasons. In this case, the question that you're asking is, I think, what's the balance there? And of course, I think the victims for certain need to know exactly what's going on with that inmate, whether because this inmate is so widely known across Canada. And, I think that there needs to be considerations taken. And I think that there was liberties taken, to be honest, that I had never seen before in my career with informing general population or general public with this transfer.
Thank you, Ms. Michaud, and we'll move now to Mr. Julian, please.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to ask Mr. Wilkins, Mr. Menard, Mr. Sandelli, we thank you very much for your testimony today. What other recommendations can you give us in terms of building a system where the public has confidence in the transfer of inmates, that they're being classified, that's not at the right level and not being overridden, the victims' families are being informed, that we have a system that Canadians can have utter confidence in? What are the recommendations that all three of you can offer as part of the committee report that we'll be producing through the course of the next few weeks?
I'll reiterate my opening comment. I think that correctional officers need to be a little bit more involved when it comes to their reports, and the reports being taken into consideration through any parole hearings or any assessments for decisions. Also, population management is something that the union or correctional officers in general aren't really involved in. These are meetings that happen at the local levels, regional levels, and national levels. We need to be involved in that, because I will be honest with you. I was a parole officer for 4 months in my 21-year career. An inmate inside of an institution acts completely different towards me as a parole officer than they do as a correctional officer, than they do with the rest of their fellow inmates. When they're meeting with their parole officer, they're not exactly themselves. It is the correctional officers that know exactly, the behaviors and the mentality of the inmates that they're working with very closely 24/7. So yeah, I would like to see, some
Je vais demander à
changes
M. Menard.
I'd like to ask Mr. Ménard. What I would recommend would be that Correctional Service Canada opens its doors more to the public to be able to see what happens in the system, so that they can see the work that's done there on a daily basis. What happens in a day? How do staff approach the detainees? What's the training we give our members?
Mr. Lloyd, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Further on the review report that was issued over the summer in response to the Bernardo transfer, it noted that the SRS override, so he had received a security designation of medium, but the 13 times that it was overridden, it says that it was primarily done because of measures that were required to manage the inmate's safety rather than behavioral concerns. Now, I find it interesting that it was more about the safety of the offender, but it didn't seem like there was too much concern with the behaviors exhibited by the offender, which the parole board has stated were manipulative, grandiose, glib, lack of remorse for his actions, and it goes on and on. Like this is a psychopath that we're dealing with, and the parole board has reiterated that multiple times. But I also find it interesting that under the definition of security classifications that was provided by the library, it terms medium security institutions. It's, quote, this environment, medium security that is, allows interaction among inmates, and prepares them for a medium security or a minimum security institution. Now, I note that CSC did note that it doesn't necessarily mean that they will go to a minimum security facility or that they'll be released in the public. But it seems to me very concerning, and I would like to be able to reassure Canadians and the families of the victims that this is not part of an effort to cascade Mr. Bernardo from maximum security to medium security, which by definition is to prepare him for a potential transfer to a minimum security prison. Can Mr. Wilkins or can any of the other witnesses provide assurances to Canadians in this committee that Mr. Bernardo will not be cascaded down to a minimum security prison?
I would like to provide assurances. Unfortunately, myself and my membership are not the decision makers when it comes to whether that inmate will be moved to a lower security level. I could suggest that that probably will not happen, given the sensationalism that is surrounding this particular inmate. But I can't be the one that makes those assurances.
And I understand that, and thank you for that, Mr. Wilkins. And I think prior to his transfer from a maximum security facility to a medium security facility, it would have been incomprehensible. In fact, that's what the previous minister said, shocking and incomprehensible that this decision would be made in the first place. And I am seriously worried that in this country, we are being led down this path of more and more shocking and incomprehensible decisions to the point that we're getting numb to them. And it was so incomprehensible that he would be moved out of maximum. And I would not be surprised in the next number of years. It wouldn't shock me if he was moved to minimum because it was so shocking and incomprehensible, the decision that took place. And I don't think we can assure Canadians that it won't unless we have some sort of legislative changes, as your union recommended, to ensure that, not particularly for this particular offender, but as a broad-based requirement to ensure that the worst of the worst offenders do not get cascaded out of our system into minimum security. I would hope, do you have any recommendations, Mr. Wilkins, or any of our witnesses who have parole board experience on what we can do to reassure Canadians that this will not happen?
Je vous dirais que, étant moi-même...
I would say, given that I am a parole officer, I would say that all parole officers work in penitentiaries would say that the criteria to go from a maximum institution to a medium security institution are easier to satisfy than it is to go from a medium security institution to a minimum security institution. It's much more difficult because the tools are more complex and there are more criteria that have to be met. So one shouldn't think that because we went from maximum security to medium security that one will go from medium security to minimum security.
With prisoners to assist them with their transfer from a maximum to a medium or from a medium to a minimum. Is there programs to support prisoners like Paul Bernardo to lower their classification so they can achieve that?
Oh, please, if that's possible. Okay.
Honnêtement, je n'ai pas entendu la question. Désolé.
I didn't hear the question. I'm sorry.
Okay, we're going to move to our final questions. Ms. O'Connell, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for the work that you and your members do and for representing them here today. Mr. Menard, thank you for your last answer because I think it would be very dangerous that if anyone would try to suggest at this committee to the victims of Paul Bernardo, their family and friends, for anyone to suggest without any basis of fact that somehow this individual is going to be in the community is simply reckless. And so I really appreciate your clear explanation of how this process works and precisely why politicians don't make prison transfer classification decisions, because it's experts that all three of you with your membership that actually build the work that to make these decisions. So thank you for putting that on the record and reassuring Canadians of the actual process, and that, to not allow some sort of fear-mongering and political, political games for the sake of, I don't know, to use such heinous crimes for a political win, I think is really upsetting. But Mr. Wilkins, you talked about having your officers' opinions and observations more part of this process, and you spoke about how parole officers or inmates might act very differently around parole officers, and I can completely see that. So perhaps I'll leave it out to the parole officers. How do you manage, or is there mechanisms for you to seek input from corrections officers to start building into a larger kind of profile of the individual? Because I can see Mr. Wilkins' point being very valid of a day-to-day inmate's behavior being different from what they're demonstrating to, let's say, a parole officer. Do you have any comments on how that interaction could work better?
Oui, certainement.
Yes. Here we're talking about case management teams, and in the team there are three types of employees. There's a parole officer with their supervisor. There's a corrections officer there too. And sometimes there are psychoeducators, and sometimes even the teachers. It depends on the file. The correctional officer has to has to write what they observe on various documents, reports of interventions, incident reports, and I guarantee you that what is written down is taken into account. It has to be. And the parole officers open their computers, they look at the screen, and if there were incidents, the computer shows them all. All of them are visible there. One can read what's happening, what happened. We can look at the violation reports, what happened. This is information. There's a huge amount of information that comes from the correctional officers, that comes from people on the floor, that comes from their teachers, from the program officers, social programs officers. So the person who takes everything into account is the parole officer. So it's all included in the computer file and in the paper file, and that is what explains the work involved in the file. There's a lot of information, and nothing prevents people from speaking to each other. These are good practices, and we need to do that. Thank you.
Either would like to jump in there. 50 seconds, I'm being told. So.
I would just add that, much as Patrick has been saying, that there are a number of people. We're speaking more specifically to the institution than the community at this point, but within the institution, there's opportunity for everybody that works within those facilities to provide insight to what might be happening. So even those that might be working with the offender in a kitchen, providing them with supervision and training, they fill out reports, and they also can fill out security reports if they observe or overhear things that need to be reported. This would go for if they're working with maintenance workers or electricians. The librarian, like, this information can flow from anywhere, as well as the CX2s who enter information into the computer system, OMS. So it can be gathered there by the parole officer when they're doing reviews, as well as, like Patrick said, you will happen upon these individuals, your colleagues in the institution, and often conversation will talk about
Thank
these,
you, Mr. Sandelli. That brings our questions to a close. Mr. Menard, Mr. Sandelli, Mr. Wilkins, thank you so much for your professionalism, and it's a very important matter, obviously. So with that, you're free to depart. Committee, I have just a couple of things the clerk wants me to address, so I will. He's my boss. Right here. We will, next Monday, we're going to meet again on the same study. The following witnesses has confirmed their participation. Mr. Sean Tupper, Deputy Minister of Public Safety Canada. Ms. Ann Kelly, Commissioner of the Correctional Service Canada. We have one issue. The Correctional Investigator of Canada, Dr. Ivan Zinger, was not available today, and he requested to appear after December 7th as he is away out of the country. So I would like to submit that request to the committee, I guess. We don't have much of a choice, do we? All right. And quickly, the travel budget for the Port of Montreal has been rejected today by the Subcommittee on Committee Budgets of the Liaison Committee. So possible option, if members agree, the clerk can prepare a new travel budget for the committee in order to present a new request for the traveling period April to June. It's the will of the committee, so I'll put it out there. Mr. Julian.
Mr. Chair, well, we can take our points, but it's for the employees, the analysts, the clerks, and the interpreters, if I understand well. If we put in a second request that was just for the employees, that doesn't include the MPs because we all have our own ways of traveling. Would that be a way of dealing with the situation?
The clerk will certainly take a look at that and see what we can do with it and what he can put forth. Fair enough. Good comment. So with that, we're ready to adjourn.